We'll now move on to look at street photography from the 1960s. This was a golden age of street photography. We're going to focus on three major photographers from this period: Diane Arbus, Garry Winogrand, and Lee Friedlander. When you're looking at this material, try to keep it in the context of the historical progression of photography up to this time. So consider what was the same and what was different between this photography and the photography of the 1930s. These are photographers who were strongly influenced by photographers like Auguste Sander and Henri Cartier-Bresson, but because the world had changed so much by the 1960s, that's reflected in the attitude that they take towards their use of the medium. So let's look first at Diane Arbus. She was born into a wealthy Jewish family and worked as a team with her husband, who was also a photographer. They were prominent fashion, media, and advertising photographers until their divorce in 1956. And then she went on to study with Lisette Model, who was a well-known street photographer of the generation of an August Saunders. So she was pretty well known, and Diane Arbus learned a lot from her. So she established her own art photography direction and had some success at it. She had a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1964, another one in 1966. She died by suicide in 1971, and it was after her death that she was exhibited in the Venice Biennale, which is about as high a career achievement as an artist can get. So that happened after her death, and the main monograph of her book that's most widely distributed that was published after her death. So she was known for photographs of people on the margins of society and unflattering pictures of the quote unquote beautiful people. Remember, this is in the 1960s and starting in the early 1960s, and this is a period in time when standards of what's considered normal and what's considered appropriate behavior in polite society were very, very different from what they've come to be in the meantime. So this is kind of an iconic Diane Arbus photograph. It was on the cover of the Aperture monograph that really made her reputation in the 1970s. Photograph of identical twins, and it shows some qualities of Diane Arbus's photography that you see all throughout her brief but prolific career. So she used a twin lens reflex camera. So you see the 2.25 inch square frame that's blown up large. You'll often see the edge lines of the film because she would print it full frame. So she photographed her subjects frequently very much like this, just like facing the camera, like we're making eye contact with them. She wanted to bring us close to people, and she had this way of just making people very comfortable with her. She had this very unassuming personal presence, and it said that she would like talk in a very, very quiet tone of voice, so people would like want to move in closer so they could hear what she was saying. So her subjects notice the kind of contact that she seems to be having with them. That transfers over to the kind of relationship that the viewer ends up having with the subject of the photographs. So some of her photographs are more flattering than others, but she always seems to be just like looking straight at a person, and they have stopped. They have stopped what they're doing, and they're here to look and to be looked at. And this photograph was titled in its time "A Young Man with Curlers at Home on West 20th Street, New York City." People who are pushing the boundaries of gender or transgressing gender norms really featured prominently in Diane Arbus's work. So this is a kind of interesting photograph of hers, and one that kind of became the iconic Diane Arbus photograph. It's an encounter with a young child in Central Park. You know, she was a New Yorker. The So this was published in 1962 and becomes especially popular later in her career. And it's when people talked about it at the time, they made associations with what they were seeing in this photograph, not just with feelings about childhood and kids acting up and kids being out of control, but also between those feelings and how the older generation was feeling about the younger generation in general, not children so much as young adults because this was the beginning of the hippie generation and the Vietnam War and the activism against the Vietnam War, and people saw those aspects of society and the culture that they were going through at the time. They saw that reflected in the way that this young child's facial expression is so aggressive out at us, and the way that he's holding this little toy hand grenade. So those are qualities that people saw in the photographs in its original context that may not surface so much for us when we're looking at it now. This is interesting to see the contact sheet from this photographic experience. So looking at it in sequences kind of reads from right to left. So the first of the photographs is all the way on the right, and then the last of them are on the left. So you can see that at first she's sort of the photographer Diane Arbus is sort of socializing with the whole sort of family group that the little boy is a part of, and then sort of singles out this kid, and he's kind of like prancing for the camera. You can see he's just this total ham and just loves the attention. There have been interviews with this young boy. I mean, he grew up, and as an adult, he gave a lot of interviews about this photograph, which became very famous. But he describes it as just like a super fun encounter that he remembers very fondly because he said he was this big troublemaker as a kid, and he just loved the attention. So he's really just acting up for the camera. But you see more of his sort of human range and his sort of expressiveness and performativeness in the sort of full encounter that you get in the contact sheet, which may or may not come out when you see the photograph by itself. So Diane Arbus was interested in the norms of Americans, of mainstream Americans. So she would take her camera out to the suburbs and photograph these suburban families, and it seemed like she would sort of like unveil this darker side of the things that Americans idealized in culture. Children. She would get in the faces of small children, and while she was a mother herself, she had very conflicted feelings about motherhood, and those come out in her photographs of other people's children. So the babies don't look like these perfect little angels that we're used to seeing in photography. Her feelings about beauty and aging and beauty standards and what we value in women come out in her choices of models who she chooses to talk to and interact with. Mae West was a legendary actress and burlesque performer in her early early years. These are her later years, and Diane Arbus sort of shows the strange, the beauty and the strangeness of aging. Let's take a moment to think back to our old friend John Sarkowski, who wrote the introduction to the photographer's eye that we read really early on in this class. Very, very important figure in photography, and this is the time when he comes into the spotlight. So Sarkowski was a curator and writer about photography, a huge influence on the evolution of the medium in the mid 20th century. He, in 1963, succeeded Edward Steichen as the photography curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. A position that Steichen had grown from a sort of librarian position to a true curator position, and then Sarkowski took over for him with a much fresher, newer perspective on photography that was more in touch with his own times. Okay, so he published the book The Photographer's Eye. That was an exhibition catalog in 1964. He also published Looking at Photographs in 1973 and numerous other monographs and exhibition catalogs. Some of the exhibitions that he produced that made strong impact on the world of photography: New Documents from 1967, William Eggleston's Guide from 1976, and Mirrors and Windows from 1978. We're going to focus on New Documents. So here's our man Sarkowski in 1963 when he was new in his position at the Museum of Modern Art. Definitely a man of the people, photographed by Lartigue, who was himself a photographer who was in his late years at this time, somebody that Sarkowski brought to fame. So this exhibition, New Documents. Now, Sarkowski put this exhibition together in 1967, and he featured these three photographers: Diane Arbus, Lee Friedlander, and Garry Winogrand. And this was the exhibition that brought national attention to street photography as it was being practiced in their time. Sarkowski brought with him a change in attitude that was more individualistic, impulsive, jaded, and complicated. So those are ways that you can describe the sensibility that these photographers are bringing to their work. Less of a sense of this sort of humanistic tapping into the essence of human life. It's more in touch with the times. So it's more complicated than the art photography that people had come to accept at that time. So it's really bringing things forward. So he published many books in addition to directing MoMA's photography exhibitions and collections, which he did right up until 1991 and lived right up until the 21st century. This is part of the press release that went out in 1967 when that exhibition opened, and it quotes Sarkowski saying, "In the past decade, this new generation of photographers has redirected the technique and aesthetic of documentary photography to more personal ends. Their aim has been not to reform life, but to know it, not to persuade, but to understand."